On a Tuesday morning at Chicago O'Hare, a single sentence was spoken that would cost a billion-dollar airline its reputation and a veteran pilot his entire future. The sentence wasn't shouted, it was uttered with the cold, quiet certainty of a man who believed his authority was absolute. "I'm not flying with her on my aircraft." The man was Captain Robert Henderson, a pilot with 25 years of experience. The woman he was referring to was Naomi Washington, a 17-year-old prodigy on her way to a NASA internship. She was black, brilliant, and about to become the catalyst for the most catastrophic corporate meltdown in modern aviation history. This isn't just a story about prejudice. It's the story of how one girl's quiet dignity ignited a fire that grounded an entire airline. The air in Terminal 3 of Chicago O'Hare International Airport hummed with the controlled chaos of departure. It was a symphony of rolling suitcases, muffled announcements, and the faint, ever-present scent of jet fuel and Cinnabon. For 17-year-old Naomi Washington, it was the sound of her future beginning. Tucked into her backpack, nestled between a worn copy of Introduction to Flight Dynamics and a state-of-the-art laptop, was an acceptance letter that felt heavier and more precious than gold. It was for a summer internship with NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, a dream she had nurtured since she was a little girl, building model rockets that consistently flew higher and straighter than any of the store-bought kits. Naomi clutched her boarding pass for Starlux Air Flight 815 to Houston. Her leg bounced with a nervous energy that was a mixture of excitement and anxiety. She wasn't afraid of flying. She adored it. She understood the physics of lift, the raw power of thrust, the delicate dance of ailerons and rudders. Her anxiety stemmed from the opposite, the fear of not flying, of not making it to Houston, of something going wrong that would derail this perfect shining path she had worked so tirelessly to pave for herself. She was dressed in a simple but smart navy blue blazer over a plain white t-shirt and jeans, an outfit chosen to project a quiet professionalism. Her hair was styled in intricate box braids, adorned with a few silver clasps that caught the fluorescent terminal light. She was reviewing her notes on orbital mechanics on her phone when the boarding announcement for Group 2 crackled over the PA system. That was her. As she joined the line, two men in crisp pilot uniforms walked past, their conversation a low rumble. The senior pilot, a man with silver-streaked hair and a face etched with the lines of authority, was Captain Robert Henderson. He had a formidable presence, the kind of man who looked as if he had been born in a cockpit. His co-pilot, First Officer Alice Brent, was younger, with a more approachable demeanor, listening attentively to her superior. "And that's the problem with these new simulators," Henderson was saying, his voice dripping with condescension. "They teach them to rely on the autopilot for everything. No stick and rudder skills, no feel for the machine." Naomi couldn't help but overhear. Her ears perked up at the mention of flight simulators. She had spent over 200 hours in a hyper-realistic X-plane simulator her dad had helped her build in their garage. The line shuffled forward. As Naomi handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, she saw the two pilots standing near the jet bridge entrance, doing a final check of their paperwork. Henderson's gaze swept over the boarding passengers with a practiced, dismissive air. His eyes, a pale, cold blue, snagged on Naomi. She offered a polite, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't return it. Instead, his eyes narrowed, and a subtle, almost invisible sneer tightened the corner of his mouth. He watched her walk down the jet bridge, his stare following her until she disappeared into the aircraft. Naomi felt the prickle of his gaze on her back, an uncomfortable sensation she couldn't quite place, but chose to dismiss as pre-flight jitters. She found her seat, 12A, a window seat just over the wing. Perfect. She loved to watch the flaps and slats work their magic during takeoff and landing. She stowed her backpack, pulled out her textbook, and settled in. The world of equations and aerodynamic principles, a comforting refuge. The boarding process continued smoothly. Passengers found their seats, the cabin filled with the clicks of overhead bins and the murmur of conversations. Alice Brent, the first officer, came on the PA system with a cheerful welcome, her voice a stark contrast to the captain's grim demeanor. But then, things stalled. The cabin door remained open. The gate agent, a harried-looking woman named Susan, appeared at the front of the cabin and spoke in hushed, urgent tones with the lead flight attendant. Minutes stretched into 10, then 15. The ambient chatter in the cabin began to shift from placid to impatient. Naomi glanced out her window and saw Captain Henderson standing on the jet bridge, his arms crossed in a heated discussion with Susan and a man in a Starlux air manager's suit. Henderson's posture was rigid, his jaw set like granite. He gestured emphatically towards the plane, then shook his head, a sharp, definitive motion. Even through the thick glass, Naomi could feel the tension radiating from the scene. A flight attendant began walking down the aisle, her smile strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We're just sorting out a minor crew-related issue. We appreciate your patience." But it wasn't a minor issue. Back on the jet bridge, Henderson's voice had risen from a low growl to a clipped, non-negotiable command. "I'm telling you, Richard, I'm not comfortable," he said to the manager. "There's a security risk." "Robert, what security risk?" Richard, the station manager, pleaded, his face slick with sweat. "The manifest is clear. All passengers have cleared TSA. You can't just refuse to fly." "I am the pilot in command of this aircraft," Henderson stated, his voice as cold as the upper atmosphere. "My authority is absolute when it comes to the safety of my flight, and I have a bad feeling. It's a gut instinct, Richard. 25 years of flying have taught me to trust my gut." "Your gut? What about your gut?" Richard pressed. "Point to the person. What is the issue?" Henderson's eyes flickered, a flash of venom in their depths. He lowered his voice, leaning in conspiratorially. "The girl in 12A, the one with the complicated hair, she was watching me, too intently. She looks out of place. I don't like it." Richard stared at him, flabbergasted. "The teenager? Robert, for God's sake, she's a kid. She's probably just excited to fly. Or she's a mule or a spotter. You don't know what these people are capable of," Henderson hissed, the coded language hanging thick and ugly in the air. "I've seen it before. They use kids now. My decision is final. Either she gets off my plane, or this plane doesn't leave the gate with me in the cockpit." The ultimatum landed with the force of a physical blow. Richard, a mid-level manager terrified of conflict and bad press, was paralyzed. He knew Henderson's demand was outrageous, discriminatory, and almost certainly illegal. But he also knew Henderson was a senior captain with a powerful union and a reputation for being vindictive. Challenging him directly could be career suicide. Inside the plane, Naomi was oblivious to the specific nature of the conflict, but the knot of anxiety in her stomach was tightening. She saw Susan, the gate agent, walk back onto the plane, her face pale. The lead flight attendant met her at the galley. Their whispered conversation was frantic. Then Susan started walking down the aisle, her eyes scanning the seat numbers. Her gaze landed on 12A. She stopped, her expression a painful mix of apology and dread. "Miss, Washington?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Naomi looked up from her book. "Yes?" "I'm so sorry," Susan began, wringing her hands. "There seems to be an issue. Would you mind coming with me to the front of the aircraft for a moment?" A dozen heads turned. The whispers in the cabin ceased, replaced by a focused, uncomfortable silence. Naomi's heart began to hammer against her ribs. What had she done? Was there a problem with her ticket? Her ID? She slowly unbuckled her seatbelt, a sense of profound and bewildering dread washing over her. As she stood up and stepped into the aisle, she felt the weight of every passenger's stare. This wasn't just an issue, it was a spectacle, and she was the unwilling star. The short walk from seat 12A to the front galley felt like a mile. Naomi's face burned with a mixture of confusion and humiliation. Every eye was on her, 100 silent questions hanging in the recycled cabin air. The lead flight attendant offered a weak, sympathetic smile as Naomi passed. Susan, the gate agent, looked like she was about to be physically ill. "Right this way, miss," Susan mumbled, gesturing towards the open cabin door and the jet bridge beyond. Stepping out of the aircraft's climate-controlled interior, Naomi was met with the stale, humid air of the jet bridge and the three figures at the center of the drama. Richard, the perspiring station manager, a stone-faced Captain Henderson, and his co-pilot, Alice Brent, who stood slightly behind him, her expression unreadable. Henderson's eyes locked onto Naomi, and this time, There was no attempt to hide his contempt. It was a look of profound, baseless animosity that struck Naomi with the force of a physical slap. In that instant, she understood. This wasn't about her ticket. This wasn't a random security check. This was about her. "Is there a problem?" Naomi asked, her voice remarkably steady despite the tremor in her hands. She directed the question to Richard, the manager, instinctively recognizing him as the weakest link in the chain of command. Richard cleared his throat, avoiding her gaze. "Miss Washington, I am Richard Powell, the station manager for Starlux Air. There's been a concern raised by the flight crew regarding safety." "Safety?" Naomi repeated, her brow furrowing. "What safety concern?" Captain Henderson stepped forward, taking over the conversation with an air of absolute authority. "I am Captain Henderson. This is my aircraft. I have deemed your presence on this flight a potential risk." The sheer audacity of the statement momentarily stunned Naomi into silence. "A risk? What risk? I'm a 17-year-old student on my way to an internship." "That's what you claim," Henderson said, his tone dismissive. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her braids, her blazer, her very existence, as if they were pieces of evidence in a crime he had already solved in his mind. "Your behavior was unusual. Your intense focus on the flight crew during boarding was noted." "My behavior?" Naomi's incredulity was rapidly being replaced by a cold, rising anger. "I glanced at you. I was excited about my flight. I'm an aerospace enthusiast. That's unusual behavior?" "It's my professional judgment," Henderson snapped, "and my judgment is final. You will not be flying on Flight 815 today." The bluntness of it, the raw, undisguised prejudice, was breathtaking. This wasn't about a gut feeling. It was a targeted attack. Naomi felt a familiar, weary ache settle deep in her bones, the exhaustion of having to justify her presence in spaces where others were simply accepted. But alongside the weariness, a fierce resolve began to harden within her. Her father, a civil rights lawyer, had taught her from a young age. Never shrink when you are challenged unjustly. Stand your ground, speak your truth, and let the facts be your shield. "With all due respect, Captain," Naomi said, her voice dropping, losing its youthful tremor and gaining a new steely resonance. "Your professional judgment seems to be based on nothing more than my appearance. You have not provided a single, specific, actionable security concern. Your feeling is not a fact. It's a prejudice. And I will not be deplaned based on your prejudice." Richard Powell looked back and forth between the unyielding captain and the remarkably composed teenager, his panic escalating. Passengers were now craning their necks from the plane's doorway, their phones discreetly raised. A man from the back of the line, who had been watching the exchange, stepped forward. He was in his 40s, dressed in a sharp business suit, with the calm, analytical eyes of a lawyer. "Excuse me," he said, addressing Richard. "My name is Samuel Page. I'm a passenger on this flight, and I'm also an attorney. I couldn't help but overhear. Captain, could you please articulate the specific regulation under which you are removing this young woman from the flight?" Henderson shot him a venomous glare. "I don't need to quote regulations to a passenger. This is a crew matter." "It stopped being a crew matter when you publicly singled out and humiliated another passenger," Samuel countered smoothly. "As I understand it, federal aviation regulations grant a pilot in command broad authority, but that authority is not limitless. It cannot be exercised in a manner that is arbitrary, capricious, or, as it appears in this case, discriminatory. Doing so is a violation of the passenger's civil rights under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin in any program receiving federal assistance, which, of course, all major airlines do." Richard Powell went white. The mention of specific laws and federal statutes elevated the situation from an awkward customer service issue to a potentially catastrophic legal liability. Now, let's all just calm down," Richard said, trying to regain control. "Perhaps there's a misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding," Naomi stated, her eyes still locked on Henderson. "The captain has made his position very clear. He doesn't want me on his plane because I am black. Say it, Captain. Say the real reason." Henderson's face, already florid, deepened to a shade of crimson. He was being challenged, his absolute authority questioned by a teenage girl and a meddling lawyer in front of his crew and passengers. It was an intolerable affront to his ego. "This has nothing to do with race," he spat, the lie sounding hollow even to his own ears. "This is about my 2 decades of experience keeping my passengers safe." He turned to his first officer. "Alice, you saw her. You saw how she was watching us? Tell him." Alice Brent had been silent throughout the entire exchange, her face a mask of professional neutrality. Now placed directly in the spotlight, she hesitated. Her eyes met Naomi's for a fleeting second. Naomi saw not malice but conflict, fear. Alice knew what Henderson was doing was wrong, but he was her superior, a man who could make or break her career. I noticed the passenger was observant, Captain," Alice said carefully, her words chosen with surgical precision. "I didn't interpret it as a threat. It was a subtle but clear refusal to back his play. A fissure appeared in Henderson's wall of authority. He shot Alice a look of pure fury, a promise of future retribution." "So to be clear," Samuel Page said, pressing his advantage, his voice cutting through the tension, "you have no support from your co-pilot for this threat assessment, and you have no legal or regulatory grounds for removal. You are acting solely on a personal feeling." "Mr. Powell," he said, turning back to the manager, "Starlux Air is now in a very precarious position. I would strongly advise you to instruct your captain to return to the cockpit and do his job. If you deplane Miss Washington, I can personally guarantee you that the lawsuit will be filed before your plane even touches down in Houston." The standoff was absolute. On one side stood Captain Henderson, a pillar of archaic prejudice, his authority crumbling. On the other stood Naomi Washington, a 17-year-old girl who refused to be broken, now flanked by an unexpected ally. In the middle was a terrified airline manager, realizing that this situation was spiraling into a corporate nightmare. Naomi, feeling a surge of adrenaline, took a small step forward. She looked past Henderson, past the manager, and at the watching passengers. "I have a right to be on this flight," she said, her voice ringing with clarity on the enclosed jet bridge. "I have a ticket. I have an ID. I have a dream I'm on my way to, and I will not let this man's bigotry stop me." Then she did something no one expected. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, opened her streaming app, and pressed Go Live. The little red light blinked on, broadcasting the raw, ugly scene to the entire world. The moment the red live icon appeared on Naomi's screen, the dynamic on the jet bridge shifted from a localized dispute to a global incident. Naomi didn't say a word to the camera. She simply held the phone up, her hands steady, and let the lens capture the scene. Captain Henderson's contorted, angry face, Richard Powell's panicked, sweating brow, and Samuel Page's calm, resolute posture. The raw, unedited feed, titled "Starlux Air Captain Refusing to Fly with Black Teenager," was a digital Molotov cocktail tossed into the meticulously curated world of corporate public relations. "What do you think you're doing?" Henderson snarled, taking a step toward her. "Documenting this," Naomi replied, her voice cold and even, "for my safety and for the record." Samuel Page subtly shifted his position, placing himself slightly between Naomi and the captain. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Captain. You're already in enough trouble." The stream was live for less than 90 seconds before Naomi ended it, but it was enough. The clip, instantly captured and re-uploaded by viewers, began to multiply across social media like a virus. It was shared by a local Chicago activist, then a national news commentator, then a celebrity with millions of followers. The hashtag #FlyWithNaomi materialized and began trending within minutes. The court of public opinion was now in session, and the verdict was coming in swift and brutal. Inside the Starlux Air corporate headquarters in Dallas, the atmosphere in the Crisis Management Center, known as the War Room, went from sleepy Tuesday morning monitoring to DEFCON 1. Alarms, both literal and figurative, were blaring. "What the hell is this?" bellowed Richard Caldwell, the CEO of Starlux Air, stabbing a finger at a massive screen displaying Naomi's viral video. Caldwell was a man who lived and died by the stock ticker and the quarterly earnings report. He saw the video not as a human rights issue, but as a multi-million-dollar brand implosion happening in real time. Flight 815, O'Hare to Houston, a young analyst stammered. Senior Captain Robert Henderson is refusing to allow a passenger on board. The passenger is a minor, Naomi Washington. Why? Caldwell demanded. He's citing a gut feeling about security, sir. Caldwell stared at the analyst as if he'd just grown a second head. A gut feeling? Are you telling me a 25-year veteran captain is about to torpedo this company's reputation over a gut feeling about a teenage girl? The girl is African American, sir, the analyst added quietly. The optics are catastrophic. Caldwell's face went pale. He knew exactly what this meant. In the current social climate, this was not just a PR blunder. It was a corporate death sentence. Their stock, already fragile after a disappointing Q2 earnings call, was about to nosedive. An upcoming merger with a smaller European airline, a deal he had spent a year negotiating, would be instantly jeopardized. He grabbed the phone. Get me Richard Powell at O'Hare, now! Back on the jet bridge, Richard Powell's phone was vibrating violently in his pocket. He saw the Dallas area code and fumbled to answer it. Caldwell, the voice on the other end barked, dispensing with all pleasantries. Fix this. Fix it now. Get that girl on the plane, get that plane in the air, and get Henderson out of my sight. Am I clear? Yes, Mr. Caldwell, but the captain is refusing to. I don't care if you have to fly the plane yourself, Powell. Fix it. The line went dead. Powell, now visibly shaking, turned to Henderson. Robert, corporate has called. The CEO. You need to stand down. You need to get back in the cockpit and fly the plane. With Miss Washington on board. That's a direct order. Henderson, however, was a man whose ego had long since calcified into pure, unyielding arrogance. He had been a pilot for longer than most of the corporate executives had been out of college. He saw this not as a mistake to be rectified, but as a battle of wills he could not afford to lose. I will not be bullied by some desk jockey in Dallas or some kid with a phone, he declared, his voice loud enough for the passengers at the door to hear. I am the pilot in command. My authority supersedes the CEO's when it comes to the safety of this flight. The girl does not fly. It was an act of supreme self-destructive hubris. He had crossed the line from a problematic employee to an open mutineer. This was the moment Naomi had been waiting for. She had given them the chance to de-escalate, to do the right thing. They had refused. Now it was time for the consequences. She wasn't just a brilliant aerospace enthusiast. She was also the daughter of Dr. Lena Washington, a formidable figure who was not, as some might have guessed, a high-ranking official at the FAA. Her influence was far more subtle and, in this case, far more powerful. Dr. Washington was one of the senior partners at Crestview Capital, the private equity firm that held a controlling 35% stake in Starlux Air. Naomi sent a single text message to her mother. Having an issue with my flight. Starlux 815, the captain is Robert Henderson. You might want to watch the news. Less than a minute later, in a boardroom in New York City, Lena Washington excused herself from a meeting, saw the viral video, and made 2 phone calls. The first was to the chairman of the Starlux Air Board of Directors, informing him that Crestview Capital was appalled by the incident and would be calling for an emergency board meeting to discuss a vote of no confidence in the current executive leadership if this wasn't handled with extreme prejudice. The second call was to the general counsel of the FAA. It wasn't a call to pull strings, but a formal inquiry from a concerned citizen and a major airline investor about whether Captain Henderson's actions constituted a violation of his duties under the federal aviation regulations, specifically regarding crew member interference and the reckless endangerment of airline operations by creating a public disturbance. The effects were instantaneous and devastating. The FAA, already alerted by the social media storm, launched a Level 1 priority investigation. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It meant that every single Starlux Air flight currently on the tarmac, nationwide, was subject to potential ramp checks and crew interviews. It was a bureaucratic nightmare designed to grind an airline's operations to a halt. Delays began to cascade through the system as FAA officials descended on Starlux gates in Denver, Atlanta, and Los Angeles. The grounding was not literal, but it was just as effective. Starlux Air's intricate, nationwide web of flights was being systematically throttled. Their on-time performance, a critical industry metric, plummeted. The stock market, which had just opened, reacted violently to the viral video and the first whispers of an FAA investigation. SLX stock, which had opened at $42.50, fell off a cliff. Within an hour, it was trading below $30, wiping out over $1 billion in market capitalization. On the jet bridge at O'Hare, the participants were still locked in their stalemate, oblivious to the financial and logistical Armageddon they had unleashed. To them, the fight was still about one girl and one flight. They had no idea that Naomi Washington, with a single video and a quiet text message, had already won the war. She hadn't just gotten the attention of the airline, she had seized the levers of power and brought the entire corporation to its knees. The first sign that the world had tilted on its axis came not from a corporate directive, but from the passengers. A man in the first-class cabin, watching the Starlux stock price freefall on his phone, stood up and announced, "This is insane. I'm flying for a critical business meeting, and this pilot's bigotry is costing me money. I'm getting off." He unbuckled his seatbelt and walked toward the door. His declaration broke the spell of silence. A handful of other business travelers, also seeing the cascading delays and the PR disaster, followed suit. They knew this flight was going nowhere fast. Then a different kind of protest began. A young woman in the back of the plane stood up and said, "I'm not going anywhere. Not until she's back in her seat and this pilot is removed. I'll sit here all day. Fly with Naomi." Others joined her, their voices rising in a chorus of support. The cabin, which had been a space of passive observation, was now a tinderbox of open rebellion. On the jet bridge, Richard Powell's phone buzzed again. This time it was the head of flight operations. The message was frantic and apocalyptic. "The FAA is crawling all over us. The network is collapsing. The board is calling for an emergency session. What is Henderson doing?" Powell, his face ashen, finally understood that his career was no longer the only thing at stake. The entire airline was teetering on the brink. He turned to Captain Henderson, his voice now devoid of any pleading. It was flat, dead. "Robert, you are hereby relieved of command of this aircraft, effective immediately, pending a full investigation. You will surrender your company ID and be escorted from the airport." For the first time, a flicker of doubt, of shock, crossed Henderson's face. He had been so certain of his own power, his own righteousness, that this outcome was inconceivable. "You can't do that," he stammered. "I'm the captain." "Not anymore," Powell said. He gestured to two airport police officers who had been discreetly summoned and were now approaching the jet bridge with grim purpose. Henderson looked at the officers, then at the defiant face of Naomi Washington, and finally at his co-pilot, Alice Brent. He saw no support, no sympathy. He saw only the reflection of his own ruin. In a final, pathetic act of defiance, he ripped the golden wings from his pilot shirt and threw them on the floor of the jet bridge. "This airline has gone to hell," he snarled, before allowing the officers to lead him away, a disgraced king being escorted from his fallen kingdom. As the media frenzy exploded, journalists began digging into the life of Captain Robert Henderson, trying to understand what could motivate such a self-destructive act of prejudice. What they found was not a story of a single, sudden snap, but a long, slow corrosion of character. Robert Henderson hadn't always been a bitter man. In his youth, he had been a promising Air Force pilot, respected for his technical skills. The turning point came during a mission in the early 90s where a tactical error, his error, though he never admitted it, led to a friendly fire incident. A fellow pilot, a young black man named Daniel Peters, whom Henderson had secretly resented for his easy charisma and natural talent, was severely injured. In the official inquiry, Henderson subtly shifted the blame, using coded language about Peters's lack of discipline and unpredictable nature. He was cleared, but the guilt and resentment festered within him, twisting into a deep-seated prejudice. He saw his own failings mirrored in the success of others, particularly minorities who he believed were being given handouts he never got. Over his decades at Starlux Air, his bigotry manifested not in overt slurs, but in 1,000 tiny cuts. He was notorious among flight attendants for his jokes about affirmative action hires. He consistently gave lower performance reviews to co-pilots of color, citing vague concerns like poor command presence or lack of situational awareness. He was the subject of numerous informal complaints to HR, all of which were quietly buried. The airline, valuing its senior captains and fearing the union, had chosen expediency over ethics time and time again. They had tolerated the rot, and now the whole structure was collapsing. Reporters found a flight attendant who had retired 2 years prior, a woman named Maria Sanchez. Freed from the fear of reprisal, she spoke on the record. "Oh, everyone knew about Bob Henderson," she told a journalist from the New York Times. "We called him Captain America, but not in a good way. He thought he was the ultimate authority on who belonged and who didn't. If you were a woman, if you were Black, Hispanic, Asian, you had to work twice as hard to get a sliver of his respect." He once told a young Black co-pilot that he should be grateful Starlux had lowered its standards enough for him to get a job. The company knew. They always knew. They just didn't care until it cost them money. The story of Daniel Peters, the pilot injured in the friendly fire incident, was also uncovered. Peters, now a respected flight instructor in Arizona, gave a heartbreaking interview. "I never knew for sure it was Bob's fault," he said, "but I always suspected. What hurts more is knowing he carried that poison around for 30 years, and that it fell on that poor girl at O'Hare. He saw her, and he didn't see a person. He saw a target for a lifetime of his own failures." The unraveling was swift and brutal. The stock continued to hemorrhage value. The European airline officially pulled out of the merger talks, citing irreconcilable brand and ethical dissonance. Major corporate accounts, under pressure from their own employees and customers, began announcing they were severing their contracts with Starlux Air. The financial grounding was complete. For Naomi, the experience was surreal. She was escorted to a private lounge where Samuel Page stayed with her, fielding calls and ensuring she was protected from the swarming media. Her parents were on the first flight to Chicago. When her mother, Lena, arrived, she didn't embrace Naomi with tears, but with a look of fierce, unshakable pride. "You did the right thing," Lena said, her voice quiet but firm. "You stood your ground. Now we make sure this never happens to anyone else again." The airline, now in full-blown panic, was desperate to make amends. CEO Richard Caldwell, who had initially ordered Powell to just fix it, was now personally flying to Chicago. He wasn't coming to manage a crisis. He was coming to beg for forgiveness from a 17-year-old girl who held the fate of his entire company in her hands. The power dynamic had been completely and irrevocably inverted. The unraveling of Captain Henderson was just the beginning. The reckoning for Starlux Air was about to begin. A week later, in a sterile, glass-walled conference room on the 50th floor of the Starlux Air headquarters in Dallas, the formal hearing began. This was not a court of law, but in many ways the stakes were higher. The outcome would determine the future of the airline and set a precedent for the entire industry. The room was packed with a somber collection of executives, union representatives, FAA officials, and the key players from Flight 815. At one end of the long mahogany table sat Robert Henderson. He was a changed man. The arrogant, commanding pilot was gone, replaced by a gray, diminished figure in an ill-fitting suit. His bluster had evaporated, leaving behind a residue of sullen resentment. He was flanked by a stoic union lawyer who looked as if he was merely going through the motions. At the other end sat Naomi Washington, poised and composed. Beside her were her parents and Samuel Page, who had officially been retained as her family's legal counsel. First Officer Alice Brent was also present, along with Richard Powell and Susan, the gate agent, both of whom were there to provide their testimony. The hearing was chaired by a panel led by Starlux's general counsel, an independent arbiter from the FAA, and in an unprecedented move insisted upon by Lena Washington's Crestview Capital, a renowned civil rights advocate. The proceedings began with the general counsel laying out the known facts. Flight 815 was delayed. A passenger was denied boarding by the pilot in command. A significant operational and financial disruption to the airline ensued. He then turned to Henderson. "Captain Henderson, please walk us through your decision-making process that morning." Henderson's union lawyer had clearly coached him. He stuck to a prepared script, his voice a low monotone. "As pilot in command, I am ultimately responsible for the safety of my passengers and crew. Based on my 25 years of experience, I observed an individual whose behavior I assessed as anomalous. My decision was based entirely on my training and my instinct as a command pilot. He repeated the phrase, safety of the flight, like a mantra. Samuel Page began his cross-examination, his approach not aggressive, but surgically precise. Captain Henderson, could you please specify what anomalous behavior you observed? As I stated, she was watching the crew with an unusual intensity, Henderson recited. Are you aware, Captain, that Miss Washington is a highly accomplished student of aerospace engineering on her way to an internship with NASA? Page asked. I was not aware of her background, Henderson mumbled. So an aspiring aerospace engineer looking with interest at the pilots of her flight, that strikes you as anomalous? Or could it be interpreted as enthusiasm? My interpretation was that it was a potential threat, Henderson insisted, his voice cracking slightly. Page continued, his questions relentless and methodical. Captain, in your 25 years of flying, how many other passengers have you removed from a flight based on a gut feeling? Henderson hesitated. None. So, in over 2 decades of flying, encountering hundreds of thousands of passengers, this was the first and only time your gut told you a passenger was a threat? And that passenger just happened to be a young black woman? Her race was not a factor, Henderson said, the lie now sounding paper-thin even in the soundproofed room. The turning point came when First Officer Alice Brent was asked to speak. She had spent the last week in agonizing turmoil. The pilots' union had pressured her to support Henderson, to present a united front. Her career, they hinted, depended on it. But looking at Naomi, she saw not just a victim of injustice, but a reflection of the kind of brave, intelligent woman she had always hoped to be. Alice took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Captain Henderson's account is not accurate, she began, her voice shaking but clear. The union lawyer shot her a murderous look. On the jet bridge, Alice continued, I told the captain that I did not interpret Miss Washington's behavior as a threat. But there's more. In the cockpit before the incident, he made a comment. When he first saw Miss Washington boarding, he turned to me and said, Look at that. They'll let anyone on a plane these days. Probably has a fake ticket. A collective gasp went through the room. It was the smoking gun, a clear, premeditated statement of bias that demolished Henderson's carefully constructed defense of professional judgment. Alice wasn't finished. Her voice grew stronger, fueled by a week of suppressed conscience. Furthermore, this was not an isolated incident. I have flown with Captain Henderson on 12 separate occasions. I have personally witnessed him make disparaging remarks about female flight attendants, mock a gate agent with an Indian accent, and complain about diversity hires in the cockpit. I kept a log. She slid a small black notebook across the table. Dates, times, and quotes. I kept it because I was afraid that one day, something like this would happen. Henderson's face crumpled. He was utterly exposed, his long history of bigotry laid bare not by an accuser, but by his own second-in-command. His defense was no longer just failing, it was annihilated. Finally, Naomi was given the chance to speak. She didn't address the panel. She looked directly at Robert Henderson. You didn't see a passenger, Captain Henderson, she said, her voice filled not with malice, but with a profound, sorrowful clarity. You didn't see a student, or a girl, or even just a person. You looked at me, and you saw a threat. You saw something that you believed did not belong in your world, on your aircraft. You were wrong. The sky does not belong to you. It belongs to everyone. My dream is to help humanity reach for the stars, to explore new worlds. It's a dream about moving forward. Your prejudice is about holding the world back, about keeping people in their place. And that day, you learn that the world doesn't move backwards anymore. We move forward. And people like you, she said, her gaze unwavering, get left behind. Her words hung in the silent room, an eloquent and devastating indictment, not just of one man, but of the entire system that had enabled him for so long. The hearing was, for all intents and purposes, over. The only thing left to do was to tally the cost of the damage. For Henderson, it would be the end of his career. For Starlux Air, it would be the beginning of a long and painful, but necessary transformation. The verdict from the hearing panel was swift and unanimous. Captain Robert Henderson was terminated from Starlux Air, effective immediately. His actions were deemed to be a gross violation of company policy, professional ethics, and federal law. But the consequences did not stop there. The hard karma that Naomi had set in motion was just beginning its relentless cascade. The FAA, armed with Alice Brent's detailed logs and the hearing's findings, permanently revoked Henderson's airline transport pilot license. The piece of paper that had been the foundation of his identity and livelihood for over 3 decades was now worthless. The pilots' union, seeing the irrefutable evidence and the overwhelming public sentiment against him, quietly withdrew their support, leaving him to face the fallout alone. They issued a public statement condemning his actions, a final act of institutional betrayal to save their own skin. His pension, which he had been just a few years from collecting, was a more complicated matter. While the airline couldn't legally seize the funds he had already contributed, they successfully argued that his gross misconduct had caused unprecedented financial damage to the company, far exceeding the value of his pension benefits. A civil lawsuit filed by Starlux Air against Henderson to recoup damages resulted in liens being placed on his assets, including his house and savings. The comfortable retirement he had worked his entire life for vanished overnight. The personal fallout was just as devastating. His wife, who had stood by him through years of his quiet, simmering bitterness, was publicly humiliated. Their friends, many of whom were also in the aviation industry, distanced themselves. The community that had once revered him as a senior captain now saw him as a pariah, a cautionary tale. The shame was too much for his family to bear. His son, a freshman at college, stopped returning his calls. His wife eventually filed for divorce, citing the public disgrace and the revelation of his deep-seated hatred as something she could no longer live with. He had not only lost his career, he had lost his family. Starlux Air, meanwhile, was fighting for its very survival. The brand was toxic. Under immense pressure from the board and its primary investor, Crestview Capital, CEO Richard Caldwell was forced to resign. He was replaced by a new CEO, a woman renowned for her expertise in corporate turnarounds and ethical restructuring. Her first act was to issue a public, unreserved apology to Naomi Washington and her family. But she knew that words were not enough. The company had to demonstrate a fundamental change in its culture. Samuel Page, representing the Washington family, negotiated a landmark settlement. It included a significant, undisclosed financial sum for Naomi, but the more important components were systemic and forward-looking. Starlux Air was forced to completely overhaul its diversity, equity, and inclusion (DEI) policies from the ground up. They implemented a new zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, tying executive bonuses directly to DEI metrics. A new, fully independent and empowered ethics oversight committee was established to review all harassment and discrimination complaints. And in a move that sent shockwaves through the industry, Naomi Washington was invited to sit on this committee as a youth advisor, her voice now integral to the airline's redemption. Furthermore, Starlux announced the Naomi Washington Aspire program, a $10 million fund dedicated to providing scholarships, flight training, and mentorship for underrepresented minorities and women pursuing careers in aviation and aerospace engineering. The flight number 815 was permanently retired. The route from Chicago to Houston was renamed the Inspire route, and the first flight under the new designation was crewed entirely by women, with a black female captain at the controls. The consequences rippled outward. Other airlines, watching the Starlux implosion with horror, began frantically reviewing their own internal policies. The Henderson case became a textbook example in aviation ethics courses and corporate HR training seminars across the country. Alice Brent, who had feared for her career, was hailed as a hero. She was promoted to captain and became a leading voice within Starlux for cultural change, proving that doing the right thing, even when difficult, was its own reward. The cascade of karma was not a simple, single event. It was a systemic cleansing. Henderson's one act of hate, born from his own insecurity and prejudice, had inadvertently become the catalyst for a sweeping, positive transformation across an entire industry. He had tried to ground one girl, but had ended up providing the thrust for a whole new generation to take flight. His personal ruin was the price of progress. 2 years later, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue over the Mojave Desert. The roar of a jet engine sliced through the desert silence as a sleek T-38 Talon supersonic jet trainer carved a graceful arc against the horizon. In the rear seat of the two-person cockpit, wearing a flight suit and helmet, was Naomi Washington. She was no longer a high school intern. She was now, at 19, a rising star at Caltech, participating in an advanced flight research program affiliated with NASA's Armstrong Flight Research Center. The pilot in the front seat, a veteran NASA test pilot, spoke through the intercom, his voice crackling with admiration. "You've got a natural feel for the stick, Washington. You're seeing the energy state 3 steps ahead. You ready to take her?" "Ready, sir," Naomi replied, her voice calm and confident. She placed her hands on the controls, the aircraft feeling like an extension of her own body. The raw power of the machine, the endless blue above, and the sprawling earth below. This was where she belonged. This was the peace and purpose she had almost been denied. The financial settlement from Starlux Air had been transformative. Following her family's example of using influence for good, Naomi had directed the majority of the funds into establishing the Washington Aspire Foundation. The foundation was already making waves, funding STEM programs in underserved school districts and providing full scholarships for young women of color to the top aeronautical universities in the country. She had become an accidental but powerful advocate, a symbol of grace under pressure and a voice for a new, more inclusive generation in aviation. Starlux Air, once on the brink of collapse, had slowly and painstakingly rebuilt itself. The airline, now simply called Starlux, had rebranded entirely. Its new logo featured a single, bright star, symbolizing a new guiding principle. It had become a leader in corporate social responsibility. The Naomi Washington Aspire program was its flagship initiative, and its DEI policies were now considered the gold standard in the industry. The stock had recovered and was now trading higher than it had been before the incident. They had learned the hard way that inclusion wasn't just an ethical imperative, it was good business. Naomi occasionally saw news about Robert Henderson. The stories were small, local interest pieces that felt like they were from another lifetime. After the divorce and the loss of his home, he had moved to a small town in rural Florida. He found work as a dispatcher for a local trucking company, a job that required him to stare at a map and track the progress of others as they moved across the country. He lived alone in a small rented apartment above a convenience store. One sweltering afternoon, Henderson was on his lunch break, sitting in a cheap diner. A small television was mounted in the corner, tuned to a national news channel. A segment came on celebrating the anniversary of the renewed American push for space exploration. The reporter was highlighting the brilliant young minds leading the charge, and then she appeared on the screen. It was a clip of Naomi Washington, now a confident young woman, giving a keynote speech at an aerospace conference. She was standing in front of a massive image of a galaxy, her face illuminated with passion and intelligence. "The future of exploration does not belong to the few," she was saying to a rapt audience. "It doesn't belong to a single gender or race or nation. The stars don't care where you come from. They only care that you have the courage to reach for them. Our mission, therefore, is not just to build better rockets, but to build bigger doors, to ensure that every brilliant mind, every dreamer, has a chance to look up and see a place for themselves in the cosmos." The diner's patrons applauded the segment. Henderson just stared, a half-eaten sandwich in his hand. He looked at the confident, inspiring woman on the screen, a leader shaping the future. Then he looked at his own reflection in the greasy spoon window, a tired, lonely man in a cheap uniform, forever grounded. He had tried to deny her a single seat on an airplane, and in the end she had taken her place among the stars. It was the final, quiet, and most devastating consequence of all. He had not just lost a job or a family, he had lost the future, while she had become it. The story of Naomi Washington and Captain Henderson is a stark reminder that the cockpit of a 747 and the boardroom of a major corporation are not immune to the prejudices that exist on the ground. It shows us that true authority isn't found in a uniform or a title, but in the courage to stand up for what is right. Naomi's quiet dignity in the face of ugly discrimination became a roar that was heard around the world, proving that one person, armed with the truth, can indeed move mountains, or in this case, ground an airline. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of karma, and the importance of fighting for justice, please help us share it. Hit that like button, share this video with your friends and family, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more true stories of injustice, resilience, and ultimate triumph. Your engagement helps us bring these important narratives to light. Thank you for listening.